The morning sun beat down on Jack Thompson's patrol car as he cruised through the city's west side. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel in rhythm with the country music playing softly on the radio. After 15 years on the force, morning patrols had become as routine as brushing his teeth. The dashboard clock read 10:43 a.m. when a black BMW caught his attention, moving faster than the posted limit. Jack straightened in his seat, muscle memory taking over as he flipped on the sirens. The BMW continued for another block before pulling over, tires crunching against loose gravel on the shoulder. Jack radioed in the stop, noting the license plate number with practiced efficiency. As he approached the vehicle, his hand instinctively rested on his holster, another habit formed over years of similar stops. The car's windows were tinted, but within regulation limits. Jack noticed the vehicle was new, probably within the last year. He rapped his knuckles against the driver's window, watching as it smoothly lowered to reveal a young black man in his early 20s, wearing a pressed button-down shirt and wire-rimmed glasses. "License and registration," Jack demanded, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. The driver, Deshaun, though Jack didn't know his name yet, reached slowly toward the glove compartment. "Officer, I want to ensure you feel safe." "I'm just reaching for my registration," Deshaun said, his voice steady but tight with tension. Something about the young man's controlled tone struck Jack the wrong way. It felt rehearsed, almost condescending. "Just hurry it up," Jack snapped, watching every movement. Deshaun retrieved his documents with deliberate slowness, hands visible at all times. The careful precision of his movements only served to irritate Jack further. When Deshaun held out the documents, Jack snatched them roughly. "You know how fast you were going." "I apologize if I was speeding, officer. I'm running late for a meeting, but that's no excuse." Deshaun maintained eye contact through the rearview mirror, his composure unwavering. Jack scanned the license, noting the address from an affluent neighborhood. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why, officer?" "I've provided my documents, Dash." "I said step out." Jack's voice rose sharply. Several pedestrians on the sidewalk slowed their pace, phones appearing in their hands. Deshaun's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Officer, I don't understand why, Dash." Jack yanked the door open, his patience evaporating. The next few seconds unfolded in a blur of motion and shouted words. Jack grabbed Deshaun's arm, pulling him from the vehicle with enough force to send him sprawling onto the asphalt. Phones recorded from every angle as Jack pressed his knee into Deshaun's back, handcuffing him with practiced efficiency. The growing crowd's murmurs turned to outraged shouts. Jack barely registered their words, focused on securing his suspect. Only when his partner Sarah Lopez rushed over from their patrol car did Jack begin to process the scene he'd created. Deshaun lay compliant on the ground, his pressed shirt now stained with road grime, those wire-rimmed glasses cracked on the pavement beside him. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Jack, what the hell are you doing?" The video spread like wildfire across social media platforms within hours of the incident. The shaky footage, captured from multiple angles, showed the escalation in brutal clarity. News stations picked up the story by early afternoon, running the clip on endless loops while reporters scrambled to identify the young men in the viral video. Rachel Chen, a lead investigator for the Metropolitan Times, was the first to make the connection. Her coffee went cold on her desk as she cross-referenced driver's license records with public databases. When she confirmed Deshaun Hayes' identity, she sat back in her chair, understanding the magnitude of what she'd discovered. The son of Supreme Court Chief Justice Clarence Hayes, dragged from his car like a common criminal, this wasn't just another police brutality story. This was a powder keg. Within the marble halls of the Supreme Court, Clarence Hayes sat in his chambers, surrounded by a hastily assembled team of advisors. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished as he watched the footage of his son on a laptop screen, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Sir, we need to get ahead of this," Marcus Jenkins, his chief of staff, urged. "Every major news outlet is running the story. They're already asking for comments." Clarence's voice, when it came, was measured but tight with controlled fury. "My son followed every procedure they teach young black men about police encounters. Every single one. And still, He gestured at the screen, where the video showed Deshawn being handcuffed. "The optics are complicated," another advisor chimed in. "Your position on the court dash." "Damn the optics," Clarence cut in. "That's my son on that pavement." Meanwhile, across town, Deshawn sat in his apartment, his phone buzzing constantly with messages and calls. His college roommate, Trevor, sat beside him on the couch, helping him ice his scraped shoulder. The TV mounted on the wall played news coverage of the incident on mute. "They're calling you the Justice's son on Twitter," Trevor said, scrolling through his phone. "It's trending nationwide." Deshawn stared at the silent TV screen, watching himself fall to the ground for what felt like the 100th time. "I did everything right," he said quietly. "Everything my father taught me." Hands visible. Calm voice. Clear movements. His voice cracked slightly. It didn't matter. The buzzing of his phone intensified as more calls came in, civil rights attorneys, news anchors, activists. Each one seeking to make his trauma their cause célèbre. Deshawn reached for his laptop instead, opening his social media accounts. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he began to type. "What are you doing?" Trevor asked, noticing his friend's sudden focus. "They want to make this about my father," Deshawn replied, continuing to type. "But this isn't about him. This happens every day to people whose dads aren't on the Supreme Court. They just don't make the news." He hit post on a lengthy statement that would soon go viral in its own right. Within hours, hashtag Justice for Deshawn began trending, alongside hashtag End Police Brutality and hashtag Enough is Enough. Local activist groups announced plans for a protest march, and civil rights organizations issued statements demanding investigation and reform. The incident was quickly becoming more than just another viral video. It was transforming into a movement, with Deshawn, educated, articulate, and from an influential family, becoming its reluctant face. The very privileges that might have insulated him from such an encounter were now amplifying his voice in its aftermath. Sarah Lopez sat at her desk in the precinct's late shift, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as she reviewed footage from Jack's body camera. After 8 years as his partner, she thought she knew him. Now, watching the incident for the 10th time, she felt like she was seeing a stranger. The timestamp on the footage showed the exact moment things escalated. There was no reason for it. Deshawn had been compliant, respectful even. Sarah paused the video, remembering other incidents that had made her uncomfortable over the years. Small things she'd dismissed, Jack's tendency to be more aggressive with minority suspects, the way his reports sometimes glossed over details, the casual comments he made when they were alone in the patrol car. "Still here, Lopez?" Sergeant Martinez's voice startled her. She quickly minimized the video window. "Just reviewing some files," she replied, trying to sound casual. The sergeant lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You know, Internal Affairs is going to want to talk to you," he said quietly. "You've been Thompson's partner longer than anyone." Sarah nodded, her stomach tightening. "I know." After Martinez left, Sarah opened a secure database on her computer. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing in Jack's badge number. The system churned for a moment before displaying his complete service record. What she found made her blood run cold. There were 6 civilian complaints in the past 3 years alone. All had been dismissed or marked as resolved, but the pattern was clear. 5 of the 6 complainants were people of color. In each case, Jack had claimed to feel threatened, despite no weapons being found. His supervisor at the time, now retired, had signed off on each dismissal. Sarah pulled up another database, this one containing dashcam footage from their past patrols. She spent hours reviewing old stops, seeing them with new eyes. The signs had always been there, the unnecessary escalations, the aggressive tone with certain drivers, the way he seemed to profile vehicles before even confirming who was behind the wheel. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jack, "Need to talk. Meet at O'Malley's." Sarah stared at the message, remembering countless after-shift drinks, the way they'd always had each other's backs. They'd been more than partners, they'd been friends. Her thumb hovered over the reply button as she thought about the evidence mounting on her screen. Instead of responding, she opened a new document and began typing. Every incident she could remember, every red flag she'd ignored, every time she'd convinced herself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. The document grew longer as the night wore on. When she finally finished, the sun was rising. Sarah saved the document to a secure drive and gathered her things. In the parking lot, she passed Jack's empty spot, remembering all the mornings they'd arrived together, sharing coffee and jokes before their shift. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Jack. "Come on, partner. Don't leave me hanging." Sarah got into her car, placed her phone in the passenger seat without responding, and started the engine. She had a meeting scheduled with Internal Affairs in 2 hours, and for the first time in her career, she was going to tell them everything. The Supreme Court press room buzzed with anticipation as journalists packed every available seat. Camera crews jostled for position while photographers tested their angles. Chief Justice Clarence Hayes had never called an impromptu press conference before. His position typically demanded a careful distance from public spectacle. Clarence adjusted his tie in the antechamber, ignoring the concerned looks from his staff. His wife, Michelle, squeezed his hand. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "The court's public relations team dash." "This isn't about the court," Clarence replied firmly. "This is about our son." He stepped to the podium, the camera flashes creating a storm of light. The room fell silent as he gripped the sides of the lectern, his usual judicial composure masking the rage and pain beneath. "I stand before you today not as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but as a father," he began, his deep voice filling the room. "Yesterday, my son Deshaun was assaulted by a police officer during a routine traffic stop. An officer sworn to protect and serve violated that oath, demonstrating the very prejudice and abuse of power that continues to plague our justice system." The reporters leaned forward as Clarence continued, their fingers flying over keyboards. "Some suggest that my position on this court compromises my ability to speak on this matter. They are wrong. My position demands that I speak. When justice is perverted, silence becomes complicity." In the precinct across town, Jack Thompson sat in a conference room with his union representative and the department's legal counsel. The TV mounted on the wall showed Clarence's press conference, each word landing like a hammer blow. "This is a nightmare," the union rep muttered, scribbling notes. "A Supreme Court justice's son. Jesus, Thompson, couldn't you have picked someone else to rough up?" Jack's lawyer shot the rep a warning look before turning to Jack. "We need to get ahead of this. The department's facing enormous pressure. There's already talk of a federal investigation." "I followed procedure," Jack insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. He was argumentative. "The video shows otherwise," his lawyer cut in sharply. "And his father is currently destroying our potential defense on national television." On the screen, Clarence was responding to questions. "My son was fortunate, if you can call it fortune, to survive this encounter. Many others have not been so lucky. The officer involved, Jack Thompson, has a history of similar incidents that have been systematically buried or ignored. This ends now." Jack felt the walls closing in. His phone had been ringing constantly, old colleagues distancing themselves, reporters seeking comments, even his mother asking how she'd raised a son who could do such a thing. The department's legal counsel laid out papers on the table. "The chief wants you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and weapon to Internal Affairs on your way out." "But my record Jack started to protest. "Your record is part of the problem," the lawyer interrupted. "Officer Lopez has provided extensive documentation of previous incidents, combined with the civilian complaints we've uncovered." She let the sentence hang. The union rep leaned forward. "Take the leave, Jack. Keep your head down. We'll try to weather this, but I'll be honest, it doesn't look good." Jack stared at the TV where Clarence Hayes was concluding his statement. "This is not just about my son. This is about every son, every daughter, every person who has faced prejudice and violence from those entrusted with their protection. Change is not merely needed, it is demanded. And justice will be served." The press conference ended, but Jack remained frozen, watching as his 15-year career crumbled around him. Outside the precinct, protesters were already gathering, their chants echoing through the building's thick walls. The city park transformed into a sea of protesters by mid-afternoon. What began as a hastily organized demonstration had evolved into a structured rally, with Deshaun Hayes standing on the makeshift stage erected near the park's central fountain. His shoulders still ached from the pavement, but he stood straight, facing the growing crowd. "This isn't just my story," his voice carried through the speakers. "Look around you. Every person here has a story. A traffic stop that went wrong. A random search that wasn't random at all. A moment when they realized their skin color made them a target." The crowd swelled beyond the park's boundaries, spreading into adjacent streets. Local businesses had closed in solidarity, their windows displaying "Black Lives Matter" signs. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens merged together, carrying signs and sharing their own experiences. Among the protesters, Sarah Lopez moved through the crowd in civilian clothes, her badge weighing heavy in her pocket. She recognized faces from police reports, people who'd filed complaints against Jack and other officers, their cases dismissed or buried. They shared knowing looks with her, understanding the cost of her presence here. From his patrol car parked 2 blocks away, Jack Thompson watched the scene unfold on his dash-mounted tablet. He spotted his partner in the crowd, her betrayal still fresh in his mind. The protesters' chants carried clearly through his open window: "No justice, no peace." Marcus Washington, a veteran community organizer, took the stage beside Deshaun. "Today, we're not just protesting one incident," he declared. "We're demanding systematic change. Body cameras that can't be turned off. Civilian review boards with real power. Training that addresses implicit bias head-on." The crowd roared in response. Someone started singing "We Shall Overcome," the melody spreading through the gathering like a wave. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, students linked arms with elderly activists, and local clergy members formed a prayer circle near the stage. Deshaun's voice cracked with emotion as he continued, "Officer Thompson didn't know who I was when he dragged me from that car. He didn't know my father sits on the Supreme Court. And that's exactly the point, it shouldn't matter who my father is. No one should face violence for driving while black." Sarah watched as community leaders presented a list of demands: mandatory de-escalation training, independent investigations of police misconduct, regular psychological evaluations for officers, and zero tolerance for racial profiling. Each point drew cheers from the crowd. Local news crews captured it all, their cameras panning across the diverse gathering. The story had transcended the initial incident, becoming a catalyst for larger conversations about power, privilege, and justice. Near the edge of the crowd, Jack received a text message: his court summons had arrived. His hands shook slightly as he read the details. The department's internal investigation was expanding, and his past actions were being scrutinized with unprecedented intensity. The rally continued into evening, with protesters lighting candles as darkness fell. Deshaun led them in a moment of silence for victims of police brutality, their flames creating a river of light through the park. "This is just the beginning," Deshaun concluded, his voice steady and determined. "We're not just asking for change anymore. We're demanding it. And we won't stop until justice becomes more than just a word carved on courthouse walls." Jack Thompson stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. The court summons lay on the counter, its official language spelling out the end of life as he knew it. His lawyer had spent hours prepping him, crafting careful responses to anticipated questions, but doubt gnawed at his confidence. "Just stick to the story," he muttered to his reflection. "I felt threatened." He was argumentative. "Standard procedure." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Across town, in the Supreme Court building, Clarence Hayes sat in his chambers, preparing to step down from the bench temporarily to testify. His clerk arranged documents detailing decades of similar cases: traffic stops gone wrong, unnecessary escalations, lives altered or ended over minor infractions. "Your Honor," the clerk hesitated, "the defense team will likely question your objectivity. They'll say your position compromises dash." "Let them," Clarence interrupted, his voice firm. "I've spent years being measured, careful, diplomatic. writing opinions that nudged the law forward inch by inch. But today, I'm not speaking as Chief Justice. I'm speaking as a father who watched his son be assaulted on national television. In a small conference room at the courthouse, Deshaun met with the prosecution team. His bruises had faded, but the memory remained razor-sharp. He recounted the incident again, each detail precise and painful. "Remember," the lead prosecutor advised, "Thompson's defense will try to paint you as argumentative, possibly threatening. They'll bring up any past speeding tickets, parking violations, anything to justify his actions." Deshaun nodded, his expression grim. "My record's clean. Dad made sure I understood early on, as a black man, I couldn't afford even minor infractions. I never thought that lesson would end up being evidence in a trial." Meanwhile, Jack's union representative paced in a separate conference room, reviewing notes with increasing concern. Sarah Lopez's documented history of Jack's previous incidents had created a devastating pattern. The dashcam footage, the civilian complaints, the racial disparity in his traffic stops, it all painted a damning picture. "Look," the rep said, running a hand through his thinning hair, "maybe we should discuss a plea deal." With the media attention dash. "No," Jack cut him off. "A plea means admitting I did something wrong. I followed procedure. If we start second-guessing every traffic stop because of race, we can't do our jobs." The rep sighed, adding another note to his already crowded legal pad. "The jury won't see it that way. Not with Hayes on the stand. Not with Lopez's testimony." Outside the courthouse, media trucks lined the street. Reporters did live stand-ups, speculating about the trial's implications for police reform. Protesters gathered early, their signs demanding justice competing with counter-protesters supporting law enforcement. Inside his chambers, the presiding judge, Howard Mitchell, reviewed the case files. 3 decades on the bench hadn't prepared him for the political powder keg this trial represented. Every decision, every ruling would be scrutinized through the lens of race, power, and privilege. As the hour approached, tension filled the courthouse. Security personnel conducted final sweeps. Clarence straightened his tie one last time, thinking of his son. Deshaun closed his eyes, steadying his nerves. Sarah Lopez clutched her documented evidence, knowing her testimony would end her partnership with Jack forever. And Jack Thompson stood alone in a courthouse bathroom, staring at his reflection, watching his certainty crumble as he prepared to face the consequences of actions he still wasn't ready to admit were wrong. The courtroom hummed with tension as Jack Thompson took the stand. Every wooden bench was filled, with reporters sketching frantically and members of the public straining to catch every word. Judge Mitchell's gavel had barely finished echoing when the questioning began. "Officer Thompson," the prosecutor began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "please walk us through the events of that morning." Jack leaned toward the microphone, his rehearsed narrative flowing smoothly. "I observed a vehicle exceeding the speed limit. Following standard procedure, I initiated a traffic stop. The driver appeared agitated and made sudden movements that, based on my training and experience, indicated potential threat." The prosecutor approached, playing the dashcam footage on a large screen visible to the jury. "Can you point out these sudden movements you mentioned?" The video showed Deshaun's deliberately slow, careful actions. Jack shifted uncomfortably. "The camera doesn't always capture everything an officer perceives in the moment." "Indeed," the prosecutor replied. "So let's discuss what the camera did capture." As the cross-examination continued, Clarence Hayes sat in the gallery, his judicial composure cracking slightly as he watched Jack attempt to justify his actions. When his turn to testify approached, he straightened his tie and walked to the stand with measured steps. "Chief Justice Hayes," the prosecutor addressed him, "please describe the conversations you've had with your son about interactions with law enforcement." Clarence's deep voice filled the courtroom. "From the time Deshaun was old enough to drive, we had what we call the talk in our community. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully. Move slowly. Document everything." These weren't just suggestions, they were survival strategies. The defense attorney objected, claiming emotional manipulation, but Judge Mitchell overruled. "The witness may continue." "My son," Clarence continued, his voice tightening, did everything right that day. Everything we taught him. And still, he ended up face down on the pavement. When I saw that footage, I wasn't thinking about my position on the Supreme Court. I was thinking about every parent who's had to have that same conversation with their child, knowing it might not be enough. Jack's face reddened as Clarence spoke, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. When the judge called for a brief recess, he practically fled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The defense attorney followed him. "Pull yourself together," he hissed. "We need to stick to the narrative about proper procedure and perceived threat." But as Jack stared at his reflection, the carefully constructed justifications began to unravel. The weight of Clarence's testimony, the undeniable evidence of the video, and the years of accumulated incidents documented by Sarah pressed against his conscience. Back in the courtroom, the tension had only increased. Every seat was filled, with observers spilling into the hallway. Outside, the chants of protesters carried faintly through the thick courthouse walls, a constant reminder of the larger implications of this case. The bailiff called for order as Judge Mitchell returned to the bench. Jack walked back to the stand, feeling the eyes of the jury, the media, and most importantly, Deshaun Hayes fixed upon him. The prosecutor stood, holding Sarah's documented evidence of his past incidents. "Officer Thompson," she said, "shall we discuss your history of similar encounters?" Sarah Lopez entered the courtroom through a side door, her steps deliberate and measured. 8 years of partnership with Jack had led to this moment. As she took the oath, she caught his eye briefly, the betrayal in his gaze was palpable. "Officer Lopez," the prosecutor began, "as Officer Thompson's long-term partner, can you describe any patterns of behavior you observed?" Sarah took a deep breath. There were incidents. Subtle at first, unnecessary escalations during traffic stops, particularly with minority drivers. Comments made in the patrol car. Reports that didn't quite match what I'd witnessed. She proceeded to detail specific incidents, referring to her meticulously documented evidence. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word as she described a pattern of behavioral issues that had been systematically overlooked or buried. On March 15 of last year, she continued, Officer Thompson performed a traffic stop similar to the Hayes incident. The driver was a young black college student. When I reviewed the body cam footage later, there were discrepancies between the official report and what actually occurred. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. Local news stations broadcast Sarah's testimony live, with commentators analyzing every revelation. Social media exploded with each new detail, as activists and community leaders shared their own similar experiences. "Why didn't you report these incidents earlier?" the prosecutor asked. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "The culture, we're taught to protect our own. To trust our partner above all else. I convinced myself they were isolated incidents, that I was overreacting." She paused, collecting herself. "I was wrong." The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive. "Officer Lopez, isn't it true that you're testifying against your partner out of personal animosity? That you've been passed over for promotion multiple times?" "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm testifying because silence makes us complicit. Because every time we look the other way, we betray the badge we wear and the people we're sworn to protect." In the gallery, Deshaun watched intently as Sarah detailed incident after incident. Each revelation seemed to validate his experience, placing it within a larger pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. The media coverage outside intensified. Protesters held signs quoting Sarah's testimony. Police reform advocates gave interviews, citing her revelations as evidence of systemic issues within the department. Jack slumped in his chair as his career unraveled with each word from his former partner's mouth. The documented pattern she presented was devastating: dates, times, names, all meticulously recorded. His lawyer scribbled notes frantically, but the damage was done. "One final question," the prosecutor said. "In your professional opinion, was the Hayes incident an isolated occurrence or part of a larger pattern?" Sarah looked directly at Jack as she answered. "It was the culmination of a pattern we'd all chosen to ignore. And that choice had consequences. Real people were hurt while we looked the other way." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Mitchell called for order, but the impact of Sarah's testimony lingered in the air. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder. No more silence. No more violence. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the final phase of the trial began. Every seat was occupied, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge Mitchell surveyed the room, his expression grave as he called the court to order. The prosecutor rose for her closing arguments, the evidence Sarah had provided displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. What we've seen here isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. Officer Thompson's actions on that day were not an aberration, they were the predictable result of a pattern of behavior, documented meticulously by his own partner. She moved closer to the jury box. The defense would have you believe that Officer Thompson acted according to procedure, that he felt threatened. But the evidence tells a different story. The dashcam footage, the body cam video, Officer Lopez's testimony, and the documented history of similar incidents paint a clear picture of an officer who repeatedly abused his power. Jack's attorney presented his closing argument next, but his defense seemed hollow against the weight of evidence. Police officers must make split-second decisions in potentially dangerous situations. We cannot second-guess these decisions based on hindsight. As the jury began their deliberations, the courthouse buzzed with activity. News helicopters circled overhead, their rotors a constant reminder of the national attention this case had attracted. Social media feeds filled with speculation about the verdict. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors reviewed the evidence. They watched the traffic stop footage again, now contextualized by Sarah's documentation of previous incidents. They examined the pattern of complaints that had been dismissed, the statistical analysis of Thompson's traffic stops showing racial disparities. Hours passed. The crowd outside grew larger, more restless. Deshaun sat with his father in a private room, both men silent, waiting. Clarence had removed his judicial robes, sitting not as Chief Justice but as a father who had watched his son suffer. Sarah Lopez waited in a separate room, surrounded by fellow officers who had chosen to support her decision to testify. The thin blue line had been broken, but perhaps it had needed breaking. Jack paced in his attorney's office, his confident facade finally crumbling. The evidence Sarah had presented had forced him to confront truths he'd long denied. Each documented incident, each complaint, each statistic formed a pattern he could no longer explain away. The bailiff's announcement cut through the tension, the jury had reached a verdict. As people filed back into the courtroom, the air felt electric. Judge Mitchell called for order one final time. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict form. The courtroom held its collective breath. Outside, the protesters fell silent, watching on large screens set up in the square. In the matter of the state versus Jack Thompson, on the charge of assault under color of authority, how do you find? The foreman's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. Every eye was fixed on this moment, this culmination of weeks of testimony, years of documented abuse, and decades of systemic issues finally being brought to light. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, rippling outward like a stone dropped in still water. The jury foreman continued reading additional charges: abuse of power, filing false reports, civil rights violations, finding Jack Thompson guilty on all counts. Outside, the crowd erupted in celebration. Tears flowed freely as people hugged strangers, their signs of protest now transformed into symbols of victory. The chants changed from demands for justice to celebrations of its delivery. Jack stood motionless as Judge Mitchell prepared to deliver the sentence. His world had contracted to this moment, this reckoning years in the making. The judge's words were measured but firm. Mr. Thompson, your actions not only violated the law but betrayed the sacred trust placed in law enforcement. This court sentences you to 5 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 3 years. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity. Deshaun and Clarence embraced in the gallery, their personal victory bittersweet in the context of broader systemic issues. When they emerged from the courthouse, Deshaun approached the microphone set up on the steps. Today, justice was served, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. But this can't be the end. This has to be the beginning. One verdict doesn't fix a broken system. One guilty officer doesn't end systemic racism. Our work continues. Across town, at police headquarters, the chief of police held a press conference announcing sweeping reforms. Sarah Lopez stood beside him, newly promoted to lead a new internal affairs division focused on accountability and oversight. Officer Lopez's courage in coming forward has shown us where we've failed, the chief announced. Today, we're implementing mandatory bias training, civilian review boards with real power, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory practices. The days that followed saw unprecedented change. Police departments across the country began examining their own practices. Body camera footage would be automatically uploaded to independent servers. Civilian complaints would be investigated by external agencies. The thin blue line began to transform into a bridge between law enforcement and the communities they served. Jack Thompson was led away in handcuffs, his former badge and gun already surrendered. As he watched the news coverage from his cell, he finally began to understand the weight of his actions and the system that had enabled them. 6 months later, Deshawn stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress about police reform legislation bearing his name. Clarence watched from the gallery, this time wearing his judicial robes, preparing to hear cases that would reshape law enforcement accountability across the nation. Sarah's promotion came with additional responsibilities. She traveled to police departments nationwide, sharing her experience and helping implement new oversight procedures. Her documentation of Jack's behavior became a case study in police academy training. The final scene unfolded at a community center in the neighborhood where the traffic stop had occurred. Deshawn, now running a nonprofit focused on civil rights and police reform, stood before a mixed group of community members and police officers engaged in dialogue. Change doesn't happen in courtrooms alone, he told them. It happens here, in conversations like these. It happens when we confront uncomfortable truths and work together to write a new chapter in our story. As he spoke, the sun set through the windows, casting long shadows that blended together on the floor, no longer divided by lines of blue or black or white, but united in the shared pursuit of justice.